So as you're all aware, recording is now in progress. And we'll be pausing it briefly during this chat because we're going to catch up on a bit of a video that's got somebody else's copyright on it, so we can't record that. But otherwise, it'll be there after the event for you to come back to if you want to. So good morning. Today we're continuing our series working through the book of Daniel, called the series Singing in Babylon, Babylon being a place for Daniel that was not his first choice, not where he would want it to be, but it's where he was in exile. Today we're looking at chapter 6 of Daniel in the Old Testament. Chapter 6 is a story that will, I'm sure all of us will be familiar with, Daniel being thrown into the pit of lions. And as you'll know, if you've been here before and if you've been paying attention, we're basing the series on a book by Jeff Lucas called Singing in Babylon. And we're going to start off with what Jeff has to say in a moment about this chapter. A bit later, we'll be going into smaller groups, as we've been doing over the last few weeks, just to pick up one or two of the issues raised and to think about a bit more and talk about those in discussion. See what we can learn from this particular episode in Daniel's story. You may have noted on the email and the Facebook post that we put out before, just a few days ago, we suggested that you might like to have a pen and paper to hand. If you want to make notes, that's really just if there's anything that either Jeff says or I say that triggers something for you, it's just an opportunity for you to make a note of that. It may be something that you want to bring into a discussion group a bit later on. It may be something that you want to keep to yourself and just reflect on yourself. That's fine. But just have that bit of paper and pen or pencil available, or an electronic device if that works better for you, just to make a note of anything that stands out for you. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and we're going to go into the video from Jeff. Okay, well, that was what Jeff Lucas has to say on the story of Daniel. I'm not going to pick up and reiterate what he's already said. That video is available online and we'll post a link to it if you want to watch it again. And indeed, he talks about all the different chapters in his book, different episodes in Daniel's story, so you can find those too. The way we live our lives, Jeff said, especially when the lions are growling, has a real effect. God doesn't promise that life will be easy for Christians, that we won't face difficult and challenging times in our personal journeys. And as Jeff says in the book, Jesus promised his disciples that they would have trouble in this world. But then he repeatedly affirmed that they would never be alone, that he would always be with them, with us. Faith doesn't believe that everything will be plain sailing. It's not dependent on God bringing about a specific outcome, but it's about walking a journey with Jesus and him being with us, especially in those tough times. Jeff Kelly, who's a Christian church leader, writer, poet, says this, and I'm going to share it on screen, but I'll read it out for those who are watching on phones with very small text. Joe Kelly says this: faith is not dependent on God's rescue. In the stories of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being thrown into the furnace of fire, and the story of Daniel being thrown to the lions, those facing death clearly believe that God is able to rescue them, but this is not the basis of their faith. These stories are dramatic reminders that God is with his people in the pressures and the trials that we face. And there are two important aspects to this. Faith is not dependent on God's rescue. It doesn't depend on God sorting out the problem for us. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel, in their different situations, are loyal to God because he is God. And if they must die for their loyalty, well, so be it. Faith is rooted in who God is, not what he does for those who serve him. And this was crucial for the Jews in that time, in exile in the 6th century BC, and at other times in their history, when God seems to be allowing their nation to die out. The faith was rooted in who God is, not what was happening. And secondly, the issue at its root is about worship. Daniel and his friends have taken their stand for freedom to worship God and to resist the worship of idols. In both situations, worship is both the cause and the effect. Their refusal to compromise their worship of God eventually has the outcome that the king, first of all, it was Nebuchadnezzar, and secondly, Darius, the king acknowledges the God of the Jews as the true God, because the three were saved in the fire, saved from the fire, and Daniel was not harmed by the lions. Daniel and his friends can endure the dislocation and deprivations of exile. They can cope with captivity, but they will not give up on worship of God. There are stories of Christians in more recent times and today facing persecution in various contexts and in various regimes, predominantly because they too have refused to abandon worship of God. The freedom to worship is not an optional aspect of faith that can be negotiated away. To the believer, it is at the core of life itself. The way we live our lives, especially when the lions are growling, has real effects. We're talking about latreo worship here, the Greek word referring to worship as lifestyle, worked out in how we live our lives and respond both to people and to situations. Sung worship is an outworking of that, whether on our own or together, but it's relatively meaningless if the way we live doesn't demonstrate our worship of God. We may not face a fiery furnace or a pit of lions, but there are times in our lives when we come under pressure. Some of those times are maybe of our own making. We've done something differently. It might not be the same thing that happens. Some of the times are unintended or unexpected consequences of decisions that we've made that were considered carefully and prayerfully, but things didn't work out. That was true for me a number of years ago. I was in a pretty secure job that I didn't particularly dislike. I enjoyed it, gave me opportunity to do interesting things, but it wasn't really developing, it wasn't progressing, it wasn't going anywhere else. And at one level, it was getting a bit boring. And then out of the blue, I was invited to go and be part of another company that was being set up that had much more potential, so it seemed. And so I did that. We thought about it, we talked about it, we prayed about it, and it was a considered decision to go with that company. 14 months later, I was out of work. The company had collapsed. It didn't work out. And I was out of work for 8 months. That was not a time of my choosing. It's not something we wanted to do. It was unpredicted, unexpected consequences. Some of the pressure points that we face are external to us and outside our control, things that others say or do that impact how we live. And that was the case for Daniel and his friends. Sometimes it's the case for us. Just in the last few days, I don't know if you picked up on the news reports, Amanda Spielman, who's the Chief Inspector of Ofsted, has commented on what she describes as a militant new brand of activism in school communities, a rise in pupil activism on issues such as racism, climate change, developments in the Middle East, children and teachers being subjected to abuse and even violence for being the wrong religion, the wrong race or ethnicity. What I'm concerned about, she says, I've got this on screen actually, I'll put it up for you. If I can get to the next slide. No, it's not. It's not moving on the slide, so I'll cancel that and I'll just read it out to you. Amanda Spielman, what I'm concerned about is not the activism that broadens debate and brings about long-term change, but the militant kind of activism that demands immediate adherence to a particular position. It cannot be right, for example, for children to have to cross picket lines outside their school because one group's religious beliefs, which are protected by law, sit uncomfortably with teaching about another group's sexuality, which is also protected by law. Amanda Spielman is commenting about the situation in schools, but it's not difficult to think about other aspects of society where the same or similar issues arise outside of the school context. pluralism, selfishness, self-centeredness, jealousy, bigotry, gossip, issues around sexuality, social justice, economic injustice, climate change, moral and ethical questions. The list could go on, potentially allowing for all sorts of so-called gods. These issues may be some of the pressure points that we face as we live in and relate to a post-Christian society, one that may challenge increasingly our ability, our freedom to work out our faith in the way that we live our lives, our latreo worship. Daniel's insistence on God's claim to exclusive worship was in faithfulness to the long-standing Old Testament rejection of all idolatry. For Daniel and for us, the issue was not only the freedom to worship God, it was the freedom to worship Yahweh as the only God. God who is constant, who can be relied upon, as John reminded us at the beginning of this time together. God who gives sanctuary, who is a safe haven. God who is the rock of ages, as we were singing, when all the other ground is sinking sand. God who, at whose name the mountains shake and crumble. God who makes exclusive and comprehensive claims taken up and reinforced in and through Jesus. The God of the Bible is not simply my God, but is the one true God. Sooner or later, this is likely to bring us into some form of social or religious conflict. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't have a view and get involved in debates. Actually, I think Christians should be involved in national and international issues. And Sue, for example, as we know, is one person who spends a lot of time doing just that. More of us will at least read and sign some of the petitions and campaigns that are prevalent on social media, even if we don't take other action. How do we do that? And where do we draw the line? And these are things to think about. The lesson from Daniel is that God doesn't preserve us from our trials, from these difficult situations that we may face. But he's there in them and through them. As we walk our journey with Jesus, through the power of the Holy Spirit within us, our lifestyle of worship will be what speaks of our love of God and his love for us. As we were thinking just a few weeks ago, we usually have the support and love and prayers of other Christians to walk the difficult parts of the journey with us. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego went into the fiery furnace together and were joined there by an angel. Sometimes we have to face things on our own, as Daniel did when he was thrown to the lions, though God was still with him. And that aloneness can and does still happen today. Daniel's example to us in this story is that whether together or on our own, God is with us. Last week, as John mentioned earlier, John and Joe shared a statement of faith for a new home for us as Buxton Church in the Peak. That's maybe a different outworking of faith from what we're thinking about this morning, but Joe shared 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7. We walk by faith, not by sight. And unpacking that statement, she said, you can choose faith or you can choose fear. We may not choose some of the things that confront us, but how we respond is a choice. Faith is a choice. When we face those difficult times, we can choose fear or we can choose faith. Faith doesn't necessarily take away the problem. It didn't for Daniel. He went into the lion's den not knowing whether he would survive or be killed. But his faith gave him a confidence and a trust in God that far outweighed any fear that he might have had. I'm sure at a human level, he did have an element of fear, but he chose faith over fear. How do we react? How do we respond when our faith is confronted and challenged? The way we live our lives, especially when the lions are growling, has real effect. We're going to spend a bit of time just in discussion groups to think about some of those issues. I don't know if any of you have noted anything down on your bits of paper or your electronic devices, or if there's just a thought in your mind, something that is triggered for you. There's an opportunity to talk about it. I'm going to put up a couple of discussion starters, if I can get this PowerPoint show to work. So I'll just try that. It's, yeah, for some reason it's frozen on a slide, so I'm going to read out the questions for you, and you can then think about them in your groups. So the first question: why is worship so vital and important? Why is worship vital and important? And then, can you think of a time when you were in a Lions Den type situation, a situation that was not of your choosing and was really very challenging, but God gave you peace in the middle of it? Is that something you want to think about and share and talk about? Why is worship vital and important? And what are the times when God has given you peace in the middle of a difficult situation?